Shalom and welcome back to another video by Hebrew in Israel. And today I want to address a very famous inscription, not really an inscription, but more of ink on a jar, which was discovered in Kuntillet Ajrud back in the 70s, if I remember correctly. And this inscription, we'll call it for all means and purposes, has been the subject of many interpretations and many discussions, and this has recently resurfaced in some discussions and has been used, I think, sometimes in the wrong way. And again, this is all subject to interpretation, it has to be said. And the issue that I personally take with the interpretations that I'm seeing, I'll get to that, what these interpretations are very, very soon, is that I think that in a lot of cases, interpretations are taken in very specific directions because of an ideology instead of a serious discussion in regards to what things really mean. And the interpretation that comes up every once in a while are attempts to argue that this image here specifically, this is a male character, and you can recognize it based basically on the genitalia here, and that this male character here is actually the God of Israel. However pronunciation you want to use for his name, academically people use the term Yahweh, which is, as you can see, I have no problem pronouncing it because it clearly, I'm 100% sure that it's not the correct pronunciation of the name. It doesn't even sound Semitic. The usage of an A at the end of a word is designed as an attempt to try to present it as a masculine name, as if it's a regular noun, and ignores the basic principles of how things are pronounced. The Ya at the beginning makes 100% sense. I mean, it's very logical. Yahweh appears as a shortened form of the full name. The Masoretes kind of hinted that it was a sound in the beginning. The shva that they use is really a vowel point reduction due to resyllabification of the sounds, and we'll talk about that a little bit further down. But I did make a discussion that's on my Patreon that deals with the question of what may have been the original pronunciation. I actually came to an agreement with several friends of mine, several scholars that I know from different universities. There was a conference a few years ago that I was in, and I sat down with several scholars, Anton, Kratz, Gad Barnea, who's a very good friend of mine, and we talked about this, and we kind of agreed that there's a very good chance that most people pronounced the name as Yahweh or Yahu, and this is why also in the usage of the theophoric names in biblical Hebrew, like Yehoshua and Yirmiyahu, this is actually an actual pronunciation of the name. The adding of a at the end, like for example, some people argue it may have been a wow, a va at the end, may be an even more extended form of the name, but the average pronunciation may have been more near of Yahweh or Yahu. And because there's no actual prohibition within Judaism to say that form of the name, then I give myself complete liberty to do this, to pronounce it that way. So if you ever have any doubt, you can just say Yahu or Yahweh, and we actually have verification of this because in inscriptions from the usually called the Yahwistic groups that lived in different places, it's very clear from the cuneiform inscriptions that they did pronounce it as a form of Yahweh or Yahu. There is the anti-cuneiform argument that people say, well, we don't 100% sure exactly how to pronounce it, but it seems to be quite consistent. And therefore, I think it actually does function as real evidence of what at least maybe some Judeans may have used how to pronounce the name. But in any case, more to the matter, we actually have a claim that this is the God of Israel and this is his Asherah. Now, we'll get to the concept of the Asherah issue as we read the actual inscription, but this seems to be, some people argue this is some kind of a birth scene There's some kind of a musician in the background. Again, I'm not going into any particular interpretation except to discuss a few things which are argued, because, again, this is more for archaeologists. I, as an historian, as a Bible scholar, I'm not here to tell archaeologists how to interpret these things, but as an historian, I can make certain arguments. And this is always the danger in academia, because what happens is like linguists become philosophers for some reason. Now, you can be a linguist and a philosopher simultaneously, but it doesn't mean that you're an expert in philosophy if you're a linguist. Even though most of philosophy is basically an argument about semantics and what sentences really mean. But because as we speak, people deal with philosophy, they're always nitpicking, what did he mean when you say this? Almost like psychology sometimes. But there's a few scenes here. Now, it's very important to point out, by the way, that first of all, if you look very closely here, one of the things that happens, is very clear that the image was drawn upon the inscription. And you can also see, based on the reconstructions, that the writing, well, this is not really a reconstruction. This is someone made a drawing of it. Very commonly, you take pictures and then you make a drawing, and the drawing also functions as an interpretation. So, for example, the writing here is the subjective with very good objective tools that a researcher would use to interpret what an inscription actually means. I think that everyone agrees what the inscription stated. I mean, there can be some variations, but I think the general theme of what's being said is very, very clear. But what's important here is also to realize that from the images themselves, you can see, and actually this is an area that I do have a lot of understanding in, because I am also a Dead Sea Scroll scholar. I was trained by Professor Yonatan Ben-Dov and Dr. Asaf Gael, and even though they might not agree with everything they say here, there are a few things which are very important to say. It seems to be very clear that the drawings, at least the scene here and the broken scene here, were drawn by someone else with different ink, and that's very important to point out. This is a different ink. Even though it's the same type of ink, it's a different hand and different ink. So when you look at the images, which I'm not too sure I'm allowed to use, so this is why I'm using this drawing reconstruction, because images sometimes, all these things are sometimes subject to ownership and so on, so you have to be very careful what you use. It's very clear that this, what some people think is a birth scene, I've seen this argument. I don't really see any signs of birth. The connection between some of the images is also a bit strange, but there's some kind of a musician sitting on a classic Phoenician throne, or Egyptian throne. This is actually quite important to the interpretation, even though the drawing here doesn't really clarify if this is an Egyptian person or not. Egyptian musicians and musicians in overall are usually drawn standing. In most of the drawings you see, most of the art that you find in the ancient world, whether Egyptian or Northwestern, usually musicians are standing. But the style of drawing is exactly the same. So this probably came from the same artist. But the fact that the drawing is on top of the inscription indicates that these were not done by the same person. The inscriptions are referred to as Yahwistic inscriptions, and this is why some people try to connect it between these two characters, as this being Yahweh and this being the Asherah. However, this is very, very questionable, and multiple scholars have pointed out that this is very questionable. The cow scene here, again, doesn't seem to be connected to this, which means that there is a possibility that we're looking at three different hands drawing different things. There also seems to be some markings here that maybe just the exercises in writing, which means this specific jar, this what's called a pitas, this very large jar, was used several times by at least two people, maybe even three, which means that I don't think it's reasonable to argue that all these images are connected to one another. Like, for example, someone would argue, oh, this is an ox scene. The God of Israel sometimes is referred to as a bullock, but this is a cow, and this is her child. I don't think there's a connection here. The argument is, and this is probably, I think, the most reasonable argument, that this is an image of the Egyptian god Bes. and this is some kind of a companion of his. And this may be a birth scene, maybe it's not really clear. I don't really know if this is how you usually depict a birth scene. I mean, I know Egyptian birth scenes because this is probably Bes, and it's very logical because Bes is usually depicted as mostly naked. The ugly face is also usually a symbol of Bes because Bes is supposed to be the dwarf god who is protective, and he makes an ugly face to scare demons and so on. So this doesn't really fit, but mostly the naked part. He's not anthropomorphic. He's not some kind of hybrid god where there's a head of some animal and so on. He's never depicted that way as far as I know. Again, I'm not an Egyptologist. These are pieces of information you gather from different places. This is what Bible scholars do. We're basically the dumping grounds for lots of information, and we collect what we need to know for our discussions. And Bes does have a companion, but if I remember correctly, this is supposed to be one of the things that indicate it's Bes. The ugly face, the naked body, all really does fit that this is Bes. So this is probably a secondary drawing on the original inscription, and therefore this is not a depiction of the God of Israel. I'm not saying there aren't any attempts to depict the God of Israel. I have to say this. But so far, anything that may have been connected to the God of Israel is usually something that is more something that he rides upon. If it's a cherub or a bullock or even a horse, there's a whole discussion about the findings near Jerusalem. There's a valley there where there's a very, very large temple, and actually a temple that may have even rivaled the temple of Solomon. It's one of the arguments, and I actually forget the name of the site right now. Every time I try to remember the name of that site, I forget what it is. Because I want to say it's Lifta, but it's not really Lifta, it's near Lifta. And I'm pretty sure everyone knows what I'm talking about, so please excuse the lack of memory here for a second. And what's very interesting about this is that there's an argument that there's a little statue of a horse, and there's some researchers who argue that this may be the thing that the God of Israel is supposed to ride upon. So far, no actual statue of the God of Israel has ever been discovered. Whether you argue that the idea of not having statues was from the get-go or very widespread or not, the concept of something that he rides upon was something acceptable. The ark with its cherubs, maybe even making the golden calf and calves was not really a representation of the God of Israel, but more a symbol that's supposed to represent the animal that he rides upon, even though the God of Israel is sometimes described as a bullock, which is very common in the ancient Near East and the northwestern areas. So it might be, but it also could be something that he rides upon. And there's lots of imagery of gods riding animals and so on. So that could be the specific case. So we don't really have an actual image. There's one thing that may be a representation, but this flows all the way back into all the way forward into the maybe even late Persian to the Hellenistic era, where there's a coin, which unfortunately there's no picture of it. It's not copyrighted, so I can't share it here. But there's a what seems to be a Hellenistic coin or Greek influenced coin where there's a bearded character sitting on a chair with a wheel, and some argue that actually might be Hellenistic Jews making a coin that's supposed to represent their god. So maybe, but again, it's arguable, even though it's possible, and I would be 100% open to the possibility that that's really what the case is. What's very interesting about this is the inscriptions themselves. These are Yahwistic inscriptions written by people who were followers of the God of Israel. And I didn't bring a translation to this text because I want you to actually hear it as is without you guys wondering to this now to what it is now. To me, this inscription seems to be a bit mixed. This is all the way down Kuntillet Ajrud, which is south, but the inscription itself is northern. The references are very northern. So for example, the first one, these are blessings. These are mostly blessings to people. There's even a moment here where it feels a little bit like the priestly blessing, which means that this was probably a common formula known in the Israelite world and overall. The one of the earliest versions of the priestly blessing is the silver scroll, which I'm hoping to address very soon. I'm also trying to do some. I was doing. There's videos of biblical Hebrew that I'm doing. There's also videos of inscriptions and so on. This is one that I really enjoy talking about because it's a very interesting one, because it gives us some insight about the kind of a basic theology of the Northerners. So first of all, it's very clear that they were followers of the God of Israel. Their religion may have been a bit syncretic, meaning that they mixed in certain things. And this is why, for example, Deuteronomy says, do not plant an Asherah near my altar, which means that there's a very good chance that within the everyday religion, people had no problem with the idea of their God having a spouse. And therefore, naturally, a male God has a wife. Even though, for example, this is not always the case, but again, because of the fact that there's male and female here, this led people to think this is Yahweh and this is Asherah, but not necessarily, as I said. So this is very clearly an Israelite inscription. Yes, it does mention Asherah, but what's very interesting, it doesn't mention Baal or any other god, which means that these were people who distinctively followed a very, very particular god, and it was just followed within the non-monotheistic, clearly non-monotheistic. Monotheistic is something that shows up much later. I'm not referring to the dating of this inscription because, again, that's for paleographers to determine. I know that somewhere around 9th, 8th century, something like that. That's what I usually hear. And again, if there's a paleographer out there who can give a much more exact definition, I'll be very happy to hear it. I love paleography. It's something I really want to learn in a much more serious way, but it's an entire study that basically it's something you do for your PhD or you do for your master's, and then, but again, it's very, very particular. And what I did here is I took a transliteration or translation into square letters of today of what the inscription says. It says, Amar Aleph. Aleph said, probably Amario. So we're missing a piece here. Amario, by the way, the yo at the end is like my name, Yoel. The yo is a northern variation of the name, yo, because there's in the northern dialect, there's a contraction of gutturals. There's even guttural erosion, but we're not talking about that right now because there's no signs of guttural erosion here. But in the north, they contracted certain sounds. Diphthongs are contracted. They're not full. They're not rounded as you would expect in the ow and so on. A very interesting thing about how diphthongs worked in the ancient world. I mean, when people talk about biblical Hebrew, it has to be pointed out that what we refer to as biblical Hebrew is Masoretic biblical Hebrew, and it's not pronounced the same way they pronounce things back in the day, which means that it's possible that maybe the name wasn't pronounced as Yahweh, it might have been Yahweh or something with a ow sound, maybe a very rounded ow kind of sound. It's a very, very good question. There's no actual way of answering this, but it's very common that diphthongs kind of retract and they reduce their roundness and even drop completely. We know in the north this happened because in other inscriptions like the Shomron ostricas, we find the word yain written as yen or yan or something, which shows that the ai or ye sound was reduced. So this is clearly a person who has his name means Yeho has said. Probably Rea HaMelech, the friend of the king. Now, Rea HaMelech is usually a title. This is someone who's very close to the king. This is a minister of the king's court. Amar li Yahali. Now, this probably is Yaheliyah, which means Yahel. This is a very rare word in biblical Hebrew, but it means to light. So this is almost like names that like Yair that we use today, names that represent light. So very commonly Yair, Meir, very common names today. I used to have a neighbor called Meir. Velio Asa. This is Yeho Asa. Yeho has done. So it's very interesting that the names here kind of use the name. This may have been Yehaliyo, and Yoasa, so the name is here at the end. I think this is part of the verb, Yahel. So this is verb first and then the name, and here it's the name and then the verb. Yeho has done. Vele, someone, and to someone. Birkat, or birach, probably birachti. There will be a video that deals with orthography in the ancient Hebrew, and it's very common that certain consonants are dropped, especially Yud, Hey, Vav, will be dropped from the spelling. So to read these things sometimes is a bit tricky. But he's saying, Birachti, I have blessed etchem, I have blessed you. Le Yud, Hey, Vav, Hey, Shomron. Notice the word Shomron is written with no Vavs. If you look at your Bible, usually it is at least one Vav. Vela Asherato. The to, instead of a Vav that we expect, it's written with a Hey. This actually does appear in biblical Hebrew. So he blesses them. This is basically an opening of the letter. So this is, he probably sent the jar with a message. And the jar arrived from Shomron. So this is a jar manufactured, or I don't know if manufactured, that requires testing the material of the jar itself, which I'm pretty sure they've done. I have a friend that's really his field. I had the privilege of working with my friend in his laboratory in Tel Aviv University and learn about how they do the sampling and so on. I forget what the term is, but it's an archaeological term. Bibliography, I can't remember. There's a term where you test the clay to see where it came from and so on. He showed me the images, what it's built from, what kind of, if you have this material, that material, you know where the clay came from, where the sand came from, and so on. It's an interesting field. He's writing his PhD about this topic. So there's an opening here. So the jar originally comes from Shomron, which I think again adds to the possibility that the drawings are a secondary use of the jar. Amar Amario, so I know I'm pretty sure it's Amario because we're missing here, but this is probably the continuation of the letter. So after he gives his salutations, I bless you to Adonai or Yeho Shomron. So he is referring to Yeho who is in Shomron. The same way there'll be Yeho Yerushalayim and Yeho of this and Yeho of that place. If I were living today, it would be Yeho of Haifa, because even though the God of Israel is perceived as a national God, there is the connection of a God to a city. So this shows us that they were thinking within the parameters of what was acceptable in the ancient world. This wasn't anything unusual to them. So it says, Amar Amario has said, Amar la Adoni Hashalom. He says to him, are you safe? This is again, or are you at peace? This is a very, very common way of referring to someone. Et birchatecha la'Adonai or Yeho Teman ve'Asherato. So he's blessing him to Yeho of Teman and his Asherah. So again, they're following very similar things. He recognizes your God is the Yeho of Teman, but this is Yeho who also dwells in Teman, which means there's probably a temple in Shomron and there's probably a temple in Teman, south somewhere. Now the term Teman can be a bit misleading. This is Yeho of the south. This kind of resembles a bit of the descriptions in some prophecies where he talks, or even Psalms where he talks about God appearing from Teman. I think there's quite a few Psalms of them. Maybe Psalm 29 mentions these concepts. But the most important thing to realize here is that there is a reference to the God of Israel of the south. This is the God of Israel of Shomron. This is the God of Israel of the south. This seems to be an outpost of the northern kingdom, even though it's down in the south. And this is way, way down south. This is, it's probably outside the borders of the Judean kingdom, which may explain why it's under Israelite influence. So he uses the same thing, and he says, and I hope you have the blessings of Yeho of Teman and his Asherah. This is Yivarecha v'Yishmerecha. This is very reminiscent of Yivarecha Adonai v'Yishmerecha. Basically, by saying Birchatecha leYeho Teman v'Asherato Yivarecha v'Yishmerecha ve'hi Adoni, and may he be with my Lord. Okay. And we're missing lots of pieces of what the message is. But this seems to be maybe a gift, and this is why it's mostly filled with, the description is mostly salutations and blessings and so on. So he sent some kind of a gift or some kind of some kind of an item that's supposed to be important, and he's sending him a blessing as he's sending this. Amario might be an official in a king's court, and he's sending to another official, and he's just saying, I hope everything's okay down there in the south. Probably an outpost of the Israelites. And what's interesting here is that if you think about it, when he says this is extremely reminiscent of the first verse of the priestly blessing in Numbers 6. He said almost every day in synagogues in Jerusalem, not every day in synagogues outside Jerusalem. There's a difference in practices between the different areas. Some places they don't do the priestly blessing on feast days or on Shabbat, depends where you are. But this is very reminiscent of this. Adoni, my Lord, something, something, something. La Yeho, to Yeho, maybe, and they're very to be blessed to him. Hateman vela Asherato. Not very clear. Hateman, why is there the south? Maybe the intention is to say Leoha Temani, so the transliteration here used by someone is incorrect, and I would maybe even correct it to Hateman. First of all, using a final form on an inscription like this is kind of incorrect, but we're writing it. But this may be Hatemani vela Sherato, which means Yeho the southerner. Okay? Kol asher yishal mi'ish chanan, who all that anyone has asked for him is graciously given to them. He is gracious, very gracious to them. Ve'im pata, pata mean here is to speak. This is a rare verbal form. But for example, we have the term yonah pota, which means a pigeon or a dove that makes the noises, which means ve'im pata, if a person prays. Lefatot, for example, is to speak with someone with a sweet language to coerce them to do something or to attract them. So here the verb pata means to speak to someone, because the verb itself in its core means to speak. Venatan lo yeho kilvavo. This is interesting. And yeho, here it's spelled without the hey. Venatan lo, spelled with a hey. This is very northern spelling, by the way. It has to be pointed out. This is very northern spelling. And we find this type of spelling also in the Bible and the Hebrew Bible in different places, especially chapters that are clearly from the north. But sometimes the northern language has been adjusted to the southern language. Spelling the name without a hey has been argued by different scholars, including, I think his name is Tropa. There's a book called Origins of Yahwism. I think that's the name of the book, and there's an article there about the name itself, the origins of the name, the root of the name, and so on. The argument there is that the name is not based on the root haya, as commonly argued today, as very commonly haya uveviya and things like that, but may actually be a root yud hey vav, and that this root, we don't know what it means, and so on. But as has been argued by multiple scholars, it's possible that in the north, the natural way of writing the name would be Yud Hey Vav, but again, this doesn't take away from the possibility that the Vav was pronounced as with a Wa or Va. Again, as we saw earlier, when we talked about this, that there are places where you drop certain consonants, especially final Heys can be dropped, but there is the argument that Yud Hey Vav was a normal way of writing the name, and the Hey is actually a Judean addition. But again, that does hit a bit of a wall because we do find the name spelled with a Hey at the end. But basically what it says here is anyone who speaks, anyone speaks to Yehovah, and he will give him to as his heart desires, kilvavo, as his heart. And then there's a final blessing here, Yarich Yamim, he will extend your life, Veisbe'u, and they will be full with anything that they need. Sava usually refers to the digestive system, where if you're hungry, you'll be full, but this really probably means to be satisfied. There's some reconstructions here, adding yuds and so on. Here they had a vav, possibly vitnu, leshem, probably, and they will give to the name of probably Yeho, Hateman. Okay, here it's very clear, Hateman. By the way, it's possible that this is just missing a yud, that the writer is just being inconsistent in the way he's spelling. It's very, very possible as well. So they will give to the name of Yeho of the south, and his Asherah, probably give him praise or thanks or something like that. Heitiv YHWH of Teman, YHWH of the south has done good or blessed. Heitiv Yamim, he's done good days to someone, and the inscription breaks off. This seems to be more of a salutation and a blessing inscription and so on, but what's very, very clear is that the level of syncretism here is very, very, very low. This is very telling of the northern tribes, where it's described to us in the Bible that there were sinners and so on, but really in truth that's taken from a very Judean perspective, the way it's described. And yeah, sure, we know that there was issues with Baal and so on, but this writer specifically, besides the element of Asherah, which again needs to be discussed in other ways, I would argue that I think that one of the best people to read on this topic, at least for me, is Mark Smith. He has several very interesting books about the Israelite monotheism and so on. He has a book called The Origins of Biblical Monotheism. He has the history of God. He has a few, the God of Israel amongst the other gods, stuff like that. There's a lot to think about. What was the world of these people really like from a cultic religious perspective? And we have a very warped idea of these things because of the influence of monotheism and philosophy and the philosophical God, which is a whole thing by itself. It severely affected how religions actually work. The introduction of philosophy and the Aristotelian God, the God of Plato, Aristotle, and so on. There's a great book about, it's called the Sons of Aristotle, I think the name of that book is. It's about how philosophy really heavily influenced religions. And we today have, especially in Judaism and Islam, there's a very philosophical God, but this is not the way the God of Israel is actually represented. And there's this great book called the Heresies, I'm translating the name, it's called the Heresies of Maimonides, where the writer is nitpicking sometimes, but it's a very interesting thing to understand how the Maimonidean way of thinking, which is basically Greek philosophy, influenced the way monotheism developed. And he was a very reactionist rabbi when it comes to philosophy. He was basically trying to respond to things in the world of his time. But today you talk with people, gods are any god they talk about, everyone tries to abstract them. But if you go to the East, it still maintains the older ways of looking at what a god is. So there's an interesting thing, like a God is here, God is there. So it's very clear that they understood the presence of the God of Israel in the same way their neighbors did. So it's very dangerous, I would argue, to try to separate that from their culture, which means that really, in truth, most of our understanding of what a God is, what the God of Israel is very broken. And today people are very afraid to talk about who is God and what he is. I think back in the day they didn't. This didn't scare them at all. This was natural to talk about these things. And this is why there are sometimes very non-monotheistic statements in the Bible, because there are places that nothing was touched and nothing was touched up. So in any case, this is a very, very interesting inscription. There's lots of literature out there about this. This is my take on the topic. Just to sum this up, this is a very, very northern inscription oriented towards the God of Israel, no other God. This is a salutation, blessing type of inscription. And the drawings and the inscriptions are not connected to one another, in my opinion. The jar was used for someone else's practice. There's a very good chance that there were Egyptians in Kuntillet Ajrud, and someone just used the jar to make more drawings, add to the jar and so on, not really caring what the inscriptions say. And I hope this was interesting. I hope you enjoyed this. And obviously I'm open to criticism. I could be wrong about my interpretation. That's normal. But I think the most important take here is to really understand that the world of the Israelites was very, very different than our monotheism. And I think that's a crucial thing that needs to be understood. Kol tov.